Hi everyone, my name is Shannon Kuehn. Yes, it's pronounced Kuehn, and I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. In my role, I focus on community outreach on all things Azure Infrastructure. One of the big focal areas within my team involves Azure VMware Solution. So I'm here today to talk to you about how you can accelerate your journey to cloud with Azure VMware Solution as part of the Azure Back to School online event that Dwayne Natwick is running. A quick special shout out to Dwayne. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. I hope you find this session informative. For additional content as time unfolds, please feel free to connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn as AVS continues to gain popularity with our customer base. Let's start with the introduction and background to the service. The cloud journey has many different entry points. There's the immediate cloud need, meaning you as a customer may need to get out of the data center business and move workloads to a cloud provider versus procuring new equipment. Then there's the long-term cloud strategy. Do you decide to move everything? Do you move a fraction of the on-premises workloads? Which business units could you move first? As well as the multi-cloud approach. Many enterprises don't want to put all of their eggs in one basket, so they plan on building workloads out in multiple cloud providers. There are also a number of variables impacting cloud decisions as well. You have to think about the business charter, the financial and economic implications of moving from a CapEx model to an OpEx model, as well as the people that support the environment. Skilling becomes a hot topic as engineers must face what life inside of a cloud provider might be like while transitioning it away from the on-premises environments. Then there's 4 paths to cloud native. There's rehost, refactor, re-architect, and rebuild. It's not straightforward moving from left to right, and there is no magic wand you can wave to move workloads into a cloud like Azure. Most, if not all, customers need a rehost option or a lift and shift option. Prior to Azure VMware Solution, the only other option was to have all workloads land on infrastructure as a service. Now, Azure VMware Solution is another option for heavy VMware customers on premises. Microsoft Azure has infrastructure designed for every workload. Everything from Azure native IaaS and PaaS offerings that provide modern apps at home, power business-critical apps, and offer up scale. Then there's the seamless integration with other Azure services like backup and disaster recovery, maybe security and identity, also management and operations. This isn't our first time building purpose-built Azure infrastructure for customers as well. Azure VMware Solution is a bare metal, purpose-built solution with hyper-converged, dedicated nodes to run your VMware VMs in Azure exactly as they run on premises today. We also have a dedicated bare metal offering for SAP, SkyTap, NetApp, and Nutanix. Talk about the dawn of a new era within cloud computing. Microsoft has come to realize that there are specific workloads that cannot land on Azure outright and may need some extra consideration from a performance perspective. Azure VMware Solution delivers a comprehensive VMware environment as a service, which allows customers to run native VMware workloads on Azure. Customers can now seamlessly run, manage, and secure applications across VMware environments and Microsoft Azure with a common operating framework. Customers will be able to capitalize on their existing VMware investments, skills, and tools, including VMware vSphere, vSAN, and vCenter, while using the scale, performance, and innovation of Azure. This option provides the most symmetry of on-premises workloads, except the workloads will run in Azure. You'll be able to take your existing applications, the familiar platform of vSphere and vCenter, and then run everything in Azure. We also believe that Azure VMware Solution helps customers accelerate that journey into cloud. Azure offers up reliability and scale. This motion helps speed up the pace of migrating everything in a lift and shift fashion, which helps you modernize pragmatically over time. We also believe the workloads run best on Azure. So it's a common choice for many of our customers running workloads in Azure. Azure VMware Solution provides alignment to business needs. Azure VMware Solution provides high availability. You've got the option to use cloud bursting, as well as you can think through disaster recovery. You can also expand your IT estate into Azure VMware Solution. You could even think about going through data center reduction or retirement as well. Azure VMware Solution helps with that speed and simplification of a migration pattern into Azure, as well as you're able to extend what you're doing in terms of hybrid cloud configuration. This allows you to begin application modernization, development, and testing over time. You don't have to embrace it initially. You can embrace it over time. There's also the opportunity to have it seamlessly work with desktop virtualization in the cloud. Running VMware natively on Azure looks like this. You've got your on-premises data center with vCenter, vSphere, vSAN, NSX. That then talks to Microsoft Azure. The actual Azure VMware Solution environment lives within the Azure Resource Manager ecosystem. You have the same infrastructure on premises as you do inside of Azure. You've got vCenter, vSphere, vSAN, NSX. We also offer up third-party DR, as well as Site Recovery Manager can be used inside this instance. Everything connects to the Azure Backbone network, and then you can integrate into all of these Azure services. We like to think of Azure VMware Solution as migration made easy. There's the Azure portal where you create and deploy the AVS Software-Defined Data Center or SDDC environment. You'll quickly connect to the environment inside of Azure. You'll use HCX to migrate VMs. You can visualize the VM resources in Azure using Azure native tools, and you can also manage these VMs with vSphere. Then you've got the low latency connection with ExpressRoute, the self-service for scale in terms of cloud all-in. You can manage the environments with the same VMware tools, so you can actually use automation tooling as well. You can use Terraform Power CLI along with the vCenter client. This allows you to modernize those apps with Azure services. You can add in security tooling to monitor workloads with Azure Security Center. For those who followed our announcement late last year, we reached general availability with the solution in 4 regions: US East and West, Europe West, and Australia. Today, we have a number of additional regions. And then we even have regions that are slated to come online in short order. Hopefully, you can see that the Azure VMware Solution investment is global. These are the software specifications and hardware specifications at the current time. Azure VMware Solution has 1 SKU. Everything on the far right should match up to what you would expect a hyperconverged dedicated node to look like. These nodes are dedicated to each customer. They aren't a shared environment that's logically separate. Everything on the left should feel very similar and familiar. Right now it's 6.7 in terms of the version for ESXi as well as vCenter and vSAN. This will evolve over time. HCX deploys with Advanced. If you need Enterprise for additional site pairing, you can enable that with a support ticket. It will eventually use monthly pricing. HCX Advanced, you're only able to establish 3 site pairings. The big piece is called at the bottom. There's a minimum of 3 nodes per vSphere cluster, a maximum of 16 nodes per vSphere cluster, and nodes here is the dedicated servers. There's a maximum of 96 nodes to an Azure Private Cloud instance. So these are some of the features. You've got native vSphere support. There's a fully featured networking stack. There's vSphere management, vSAN, and NSXT. And then HCX Advanced or Enterprise can be used to support migration. That is the tool you will use for a fully supported SLA-backed guarantee migration of VMs from on-premises into Azure. Once you get into Azure, there's a number of integrations. There's the management and governance integration. There's a number of integrations with security, both with Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel. There's low latency connectivity to Azure. You're using ExpressRoute. You can use the entire Azure ecosystem as well. Once you get your environment over into Azure, it's like achievement unlocked. There's a single point of support. You're only calling Microsoft if there are any issues with your Azure VMware Solution environment. And once you reach this sort of software-defined universe of Azure, you can start extending what you're doing with the DevOps toolchain, and that can integrate into Azure VMware Solution. Azure VMware Solution also has high-performance cloud infrastructure. There's optimized elastic infrastructure, there's automated self-service provisioning. Remember, these are dedicated, isolated bare metal infrastructure nodes for each customer. You've got redundancy and placement control, as well as security and encryption. Let's talk about what the deployment steps look like. So first, you'll deploy a private cloud in Azure. You'll then create a virtualized network. You'll create an Azure bastion and a jump host. From there, you'll create a gateway subnet inside of the VNet, as well as a VNet gateway. You'll create an auth key in the VNet gateway, and then you'll connect the AVS Express route to a VNet gateway. Let's take a step back here and mention the Azure VMware Solution environment. At a minimum, you deploy it with 3 dedicated nodes. One of the extra components you wind up getting during the deployment process is an express route circuit. That express route circuit needs to be peered into an Azure VNet in order for network connectivity in the Azure VMware Solution Private Cloud to reach Azure. Then you'll connect VMware on-premises and AVS. So you'll connect to that jump host behind the Azure Bastion. You'll connect to the vCenter environment. Your credentials are registered during the deployment of the resource. You can also connect to NSXT. You will need to enable Global Reach for on-premises access. Global Reach is an add-on for ExpressRoute. The supported SLA is to have your own ExpressRoute circuit, and then you'll get the ExpressRoute circuit from Azure VMware Solution. You need Global Reach to enable east-west routing between those 2 circuits. Then you'll join your vCenter to the domain and configure the identity source. Let's step through what the network architecture looks like next. So this is basic interconnectivity. Once you deploy the Azure VMware Solution Private Cloud, you have connectivity with an ExpressRoute circuit that is provisioned with the service into an Azure VNet. This doesn't take into consideration any sort of hybrid connectivity. This is just connectivity between the AVS environment and Azure. The Azure VMware Solution Network requires a minimum of a /22 CIDR network address block for subnets. You'll carve that up into different segments. It can even be a bigger CIDR address block as well. This is full interconnectivity. So you need to enable global reach between your on-premises ExpressRoute circuit and the Azure VMware Solution ExpressRoute. This enables you to fully migrate a VM from on-premises into Azure using your own ExpressRoute circuit. VMware backs this configuration with an SLA. There's also the option to build out a vWAN hub and connect a site-to-site VPN into Azure. The vWAN hub will advertise routes between the site-to-site VPN and the Azure VMware Solution ExpressRoute. This configuration is supported for pre-ExpressRoute testing and in environments that do not need migration SLAs. So if you're a customer that just needs hybrid connectivity, and this environment will always be 100% separate, meaning you're not going to migrate servers from on-premises into Azure, you could actually have this as a supported configuration within your environment. Let's take some time to talk through the migration patterns. So you'll assess the VMware environment. That will help you identify the workloads to migrate. That will then define the migration approach. HCX can support live vMotion, bulk vMotion, and cold vMotion. Live vMotion is most typically used for production-based workloads that really can't get a great change window to migrate from on-premises into Azure. This then helps you identify steps to full production. You start moving into that testing and validation phase next. So you build out the initial workload and the proof of concept. You'll create a private cloud, you'll move a few VMs using the preferred migration type, and that starts to help you transition to production. That's where you will see the at-scale migration and adoption of Azure VMware Solution. If you need support, you can use Microsoft Fast Track, and then there's a partner ecosystem as well. The partners have to go through a certification process each year to be listed. So there is support to help speed up the migration pattern. Azure VMware Solution and Azure Migrate are now very much so joined at the hip. You can add the assessment into the mix here, and it will give you what it looks like from a cost perspective if you were to migrate your VMs on premises into Azure VMware Solution. This reached general availability at Ignite earlier in the year, right around March 2021. Then you'll use VMware HCX for that migration into Azure VMware Solution. This helps you with a large-scale bulk migration using HCX. There's replication-assisted vMotion. And then there's any vSphere to vSphere migration. So if you have a number of different vSphere environments, you could use HCX to migrate VMs from those environments to maybe a central vSphere environment. HCX will establish a site pairing that allows you to stand up what is like a site-to-site VPN between on-premises and Azure VMware Solution. HCX also provides minimal DR support. The recommended pattern is to lean on Azure Site Recovery or Site Recovery Manager if you have the licensing to run within your Azure VMware Solution environment. HCX offers up parallel VM migration threads. HCX can also allow you to not change your IP address. You can extend Layer 2 into Azure, and you don't need a NAT to do it. Lastly, HCX provides a secure proxy for vMotion and replication traffic. Let's talk through what the management and operations of an AVS environment look like next. I think a lot of us have seen this visual before with Azure in the center. Just know that you could actually replace Azure with Azure VMware Solution. So you can secure, protect, monitor, configure, and govern the same way you could if your Azure environment was 100% living on infrastructure as a service. You're able to create operational consistency for admins as you continue to use VMware for resources running on the Azure infrastructure you provisioned, including the vSphere client and NSXT manager. Access to vSphere, HCX, and NSXT are enabled during the private cloud deployment process. Credentials are registered in Azure to connect to the private cluster hosts. There's also seamless management for Azure infrastructure resources, so you can easily scale infrastructure as your business needs require it through the Azure portal. You can add new nodes as required to increase compute and storage during peak times. You can delete those nodes seasonally when the infrastructure demands are lower. Just know that you can't go lower than 3 nodes per cluster. There's a maximum of 16 nodes in a vSphere cluster and a maximum of 96 nodes to an Azure Private Cloud instance. In terms of the Azure VMware Solution-Shared responsibility matrix, we largely see this related to infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. This is what it would look like if you were to transition your workloads into Azure VMware Solution. You're no longer on the hook for physical security, host patching, hardware failures, any of the identity management, any of the lifecycle management of the actual VMware infrastructure. You instead get to free up your time to focus on the things that are most exciting to your business. You can start to bring in configuration management. You can start to lifecycle your workloads appropriately, so you don't have legacy-based OSs living in your environment. This allows your operation folks to free themselves up and to start embracing cloud as well. I'd like to include this as a quick visual. Everything related to the deployment is abstracted. So the private cloud, the connection point into the Azure VNet, everything deployed into the Azure region, and then enabling network connectivity using global reach. You're accessing the environment through the Azure portal, through any of the REST APIs, through PowerShell, the Azure CLI, Terraform, or Azure Resource Manager templates. You're only managing the private cloud in 2 different sections within the portal. Those sections are Manage and Workload Networking. Manage provides all of the ways to connect to the environment. It also allows you to make your cluster larger or reduce the cluster size, as well as go through any of the add-ons like Site Recovery Manager or HCX. Workload Networking is all of the simplified NSXT configuration. A number of customers had not yet adopted NSXT on premises, so we've exposed a simplified interface to allow customers that same configuration pattern as if they were experienced with NSXT. The vSphere admin is Cloud Admin. It's very similar to administrator at vSphere.local. There are a number of differences, though. Customers don't have access to the ESXi hosts directly unless there's a support ticket. Then you'll use the HCX environment for hybrid lift and shift. All of the configurations are highlighted inside this slide. So let's talk about the integrations into Azure next. These are some of the popular integrations right now with our customer base. Azure NetApp Files for file share, Azure Blob Storage and the iSCSI disk pools, which is currently in public preview, Azure Traffic Manager and Application Gateway. There's support for Hub and Spoke. You can integrate with Microsoft Azure Backup Server or a handful of third-party backup vendors, Commvault, Veritas, Veeam, Rubrik. There's Azure Monitor integration, as well as integrations with both Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel. This is a high-level overview of what a workload integration would look like. At the very bottom left-hand side, you've got your Azure VMware Solution Software-Defined Data Center. You've used Azure Arc to enable that environment to be controlled, managed, and administered within the Azure portal. You can onboard Azure Automation and Azure Update Management versus taking SCCM or WSUS or any sort of Linux-based patching system into Azure. Everything reports to a log analytics workspace, which allows you to extend what you're doing related to security and monitoring your environment. You can integrate to Azure Monitor, as well as Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel. Alerts can be configured for monitoring or any security events you want to be notified on, as well as you can extend to an ITSM solution as well. This is what the actual storage integration looks like. So Blob Storage, you can integrate with Azure Files, FileSync, and NetApp Files. Then there's the SQL integration. Azure VMware Solution environments can integrate with Azure SQL, SQL Managed Instances, and Azure PostgreSQL Server. This is a quick high-level overview of what the Microsoft Azure Backup Server looks like. That's deployed inside of a separate Azure Virtual Network. The Azure Recovery Services Vault is registered with the MABS server, and then servers in the Azure VMware Solution environment back up to the Microsoft Azure Backup Server. Another integration is with Application Gateway. When these VMware VMs live on premises, it's next to impossible for an Application Gateway to be used. Once you move these VMware environments to Azure, you can then lean on these PaaS-based services that you can't really use on premises. This would be for a web server, whether it be highly available or a single server, and it extends what customers can do related to Azure. Let's talk a little bit about support next. So Microsoft support is the single point of contact. Azure VMware Solution is validated, supported, and certified by VMware and Microsoft. If a customer has a problem, they only have to open up a ticket with Microsoft. Microsoft becomes the first contact, and they make a decision based on the problem type. All Azure-related issues are addressed by a Microsoft engineer. When the VMware support is required, Microsoft will coordinate with VMware for product-specific support. The customer doesn't need to open up two separate tickets. As a result, Microsoft continues to be the central point to resolution. There are a number of technical resources as well. Microsoft worked with VMware to build out a hands-on lab for Azure VMware Solution. If you're familiar with VMware's hands-on labs, these are similar. They are a click-through guided tutorial of how to set up the Azure VMware Solution private cloud, and then how to connect that private cloud to on-premises. The other lab involves how to migrate workloads using HCX. Microsoft also has an Azure VMware Solution Learn Path as well. This Learn Path consists of 3 separate modules. The first module introduces the service, talks through the value proposition, and helps customers decide on if it's the right resource to deploy for their environment. The second module covers how to deploy Azure VMware Solution. The third module covers how to migrate VMs on premises into Azure VMware Solution. Additionally, these are other resources: the overview of the service, all of the documentation, which includes all of the tutorials, all of the prerequisites you have to factor in, everything you need to know in terms of deployment, configuration, and ongoing management, plus maintenance. The Azure VMware Solution videos is a curated YouTube playlist of a number of different types of videos. In terms of ports and protocols, you'll want to head to that specific URL. The HCX documentation and release notes are actually linked to within Microsoft's documentation, so I want to call them out here in terms of resources. And then there's the Azure Migrate documentation that talks through how to set up an Azure Migrate assessment for VMs migrating into Azure VMware Solution from an on-premises VMware environment. Let's go through a few demos next. Deploying the solution is straightforward and simple using the Azure portal. First, use the search bar above to find Azure VMware Solution. Next, you should see there are no Azure VMware Solution private clouds deployed. Select Create at the top. You should see the Create a Private Cloud pane open up. This pane highlights everything you need from a prerequisites perspective before deploying the cluster within your environment. You need to be an enterprise agreement customer or a cloud solution provider customer. You must also open up a ticket with support to ensure hosts are allocated to your subscription for deployment. You will need to register the Azure Resource Provider for Azure VMware Solution. You will also need a non-overlapping /22 CIDR address block for the AVS management network. The deployment in Azure creates a number of IP segments for vCenter, HCX, NSXT, and vMotion. After you've ensured you've met all the prerequisites, select Next, Basics. Make sure you are selecting the right subscription that's been whitelisted for your Azure VMware Solution deployment. Associate the deployment to the resource group that either already exists or create a brand new resource group. Inside this demo, we'll use an existing resource group. Next, provide a resource name. Tie the deployment to the right region. This example uses North Central. Select the size of host, scroll down, and input the /22 CIDR address block for the private cloud deployment. If tags are required for your environment related to billing in Azure, select Next, Tags. Type in the tags required for your environment. Then select Review and Create. The Azure VMware Solution environment will be validated by a pre-check that runs before deployment. Once that completes, you will see all the different Azure settings you configured earlier: the subscription, the resource group, location, resource name, SKU, number of hosts, and tags. At this point, select Create. The deployment itself takes approximately 3 to 4 hours. During this process, the bare metal hosts are provisioned with vCenter, vSAN, and NSXT. When the deployment finishes, go to the resource in the Azure portal. You will see the build status as succeeded. Next, you will need to connect the Azure VMware Solution Express route that deploys with the service to an Azure VNet. This provides connectivity between the private cloud and resources in Azure. On the Azure VNet Connect screen, you will see there's an option to tie the deployment to an Azure VNet. The VNet requires a VNet Gateway subnet configured in an existing VNet, or you can create a new virtual network from this initial screen under Connectivity. After you select VNet with the Gateway subnet, select Save, and this triggers a build of a few different resources: a virtual network gateway for ExpressRoute, a public IP for the VNet gateway, and a connection object that establishes the ExpressRoute peering into an Azure VNet. After this completes, your Azure VMware Solution Private Cloud is ready for you to connect to your on-premises environment. Head back to Connectivity and click on ExpressRoute. Here you can see there's an ExpressRoute authorization key being used for the Azure VMware Solution ExpressRoute circuit inside of the Azure VNet. After Azure VMware Solution deploys, you are able to start building applications and workloads within your cluster on Azure. Everything looks and feels as if it is vSphere on premises. Within this demo environment, we have an Active Directory server, a web front end, and a database backend. These represent one migrated workload from on-premises. Microsoft Azure native services let you monitor, manage, and protect your VMs in Azure VMware Solution the same way you would monitor, manage, and protect your VMs on-premises. In fact, the VMs in Azure VMware Solution are much like VMs that may exist on-premises. As a consumer of the service, you can integrate with a number of services that will provide visibility into the performance and health of your workloads. The first of these integrations involves Azure Arc. Azure Arc extends Azure management to any infrastructure, including Azure VMware Solution, on-premises VMs, or other cloud platforms. Azure Arc-enabled servers let you manage your Windows and Linux physical servers and virtual machines hosted outside of Azure, on your corporate network, or in another cloud provider. Azure VMware Solution VMs technically connect to an Azure VNet by way of the express route circuit that deploys with the service, so the recommended pattern is to treat them like hybrid VMs living on premises. In the Azure portal, search for Azure Arc. When the list of resources starts to display, select Servers, Azure Arc. Click on Add at the top. As you can see, an engineer has options here related to deployment. You can enable a single server, multiple servers with a service principal, and then add update management servers, which is currently in preview. Within this demo, we'll select Generate Script. You will be presented with a prerequisite screen at first. This is good to review if you haven't evaluated what it would take to onboard a VM into Azure Arc. Select Next Resource Details. Tie the onboarding to the right subscription, resource group, region, and ensure you select the right operating system, Windows in this instance. Underneath Network Connectivity, note the different options you could choose if you wanted to ensure communication into Azure from VMs within Azure VMware Solution. For purposes of this demo, we'll use Public Endpoint. Select Next, Tags. Let's use the pre-populated tags on this screen. Provide production for the data center. Pick Chicago for the city, Illinois for the state, and USA for the country. Note, you can also use custom tags if you decide some of the physical location tags don't provide enough metadata for your environment. Once complete, select Next Download. The Azure Resource Manager portal generates a PowerShell script that will effectively onboard one server. If you are onboarding multiple servers, dedicate a service principal to the task and onboard all servers at the same time. Scroll down and select Download. Take a look at the file once it downloads, and you will see what it's doing. It's invoking a web request to download the package, and then the PowerShell script installs the package. Then the script runs a command that links the server to the right region and resource group in Azure. Next, log into one of the servers you would like to onboard within Azure VMware Solution. Run the script, and if prompted with a security warning, select Run Once. The script provides some verbose flags that indicate installation status. Eventually, you should see a requirement to log in and authenticate with the code provided. After inputting the code, you will see a dialog prompt asking you if you're trying to sign into Azure Connected Machine Agent. Select Continue and close out of the browser. After waiting a bit, you will see that the server has been successfully onboarded to Azure Arc. Next, flip back to the Azure Resource Manager portal. Search for Azure Arc again from the portal, and the server you onboarded will now show up as registered with Azure Arc. This allows you to seamlessly manage and integrate with Azure native services for a comprehensive view of workload performance and health. After you Azure Arc enable your Azure VMware Solution servers, integrating with other Azure native services becomes easy. For our next integration, we'll enable Log Analytics. Log Analytics is a tool in the Azure portal to edit and run log queries from data collected by Azure Monitor Logs. From within Azure Arc, select a server that's been Azure Arc enabled, and let's add the Log Analytics agent extension. Enabling the Log Analytics extension for Azure Arc enabled servers requires a Log Analytics Workspace ID and Workspace key. For this demo, a Log Analytics Workspace was previously created. When you select the Log Analytics Workspace resource underneath Settings, select Agents Management. Copy both the Workspace ID and the primary key to use for onboarding the Log Analytics extension on the Azure Arc enabled server. Flip back to the Azure Arc enabled servers. Select a server and then select Extensions underneath Settings. Click Add. Select the Log Analytics agent Azure Arc. When the first screen pops up, select Create at the bottom. Copy and paste in the Workspace ID and Workspace key so the Azure Arc enabled VM reports collected metrics and data to the right workspace in Azure. Select Review and Create after you've copied and pasted both pieces of data in for the installation. After the validation passes, select Create. Once some time passes, go to the resource group where the Log Analytics Workspace is deployed. Under General, select Logs. In this example, the heartbeat table is used for a quick query to ensure VMs are reporting to the right workspace. The query language Log Analytics uses is called the Custo query language. In the query, we're specifying that the OS type needs to be Windows as an absolute match. We're then using the distinct operator on the computer field to deduplicate data and ensure both VMs are reporting to the right workspace. As the results show, both Azure VMware Solution VMs are reporting into the Log Analytics workspace to make use of both Azure Monitor and Log Analytics in terms of Azure native monitoring tools. Next, go back to the Azure Arc enabled servers. Select one server and underneath Operations, select Policies. Azure Policy evaluates resources in Azure by comparing the properties of those resources to business configuration rules. These rules, described in JSON format, are known as policy definitions. Now that the Azure VMware Solution VMs are Arc enabled, you can apply Azure policies against the VM objects to ensure all VMs meet the right configuration baseline. For the selected server, ASC stands for Azure Security Center. A number of Azure Security Center policies can be put together to form an initiative for how the environment should be configured. Based upon the Data Protection and Open Source Relational Database initiatives, the VM is compliant. You can drill down further into the initiative definition to see what makes up the full baseline. For this initiative definition, it's ensuring Azure Defender has been deployed to protect the databases on this VM. Next, let's set up Azure Update Management. Customers can lean on the Azure native tool that allows patching of servers within Azure and Azure Arc enabled servers. This solution requires an Azure Automation account. If you're not familiar with how to set that up, click on the blue ribbon at the top within your Azure Arc enabled server. Go back to the Azure portal, search for and select Automation Accounts, then select Create. Provide a name, tie the deployment to a subscription, pick a resource group, and leave the slider bar at Yes for creating an Azure Run As account. After everything is filled out, select Create. Once the automation account deploys, select the resource. Underneath Update Management, take note that you're asked which Log Analytics workspace you want to link the deployment to. It should auto-populate the subscription and automation account. Select Enable at the bottom. After enabling Update Management, you will want to manage the VMs reporting into that Log Analytics workspace. Click on Click to Manage Machines. Enable Update Management on each VM that reports into the Log Analytics workspace. Select Enable at the bottom. Update Management requires that you enable the solution for each VM reporting into the workspace in order to use the tool. After some time passes, you should be able to go back into Update Management and see what VMs are reporting as compliant or non-compliant. If the VMs have not yet been assessed, Factor in some more time before scheduling any patch windows. Notice how you can filter the platform between Azure and non-Azure. This provides a way for you to see exactly what security patches have been applied and which ones still need to be applied. Using Azure native integrations like Azure Update Management, Azure Policy, and Log Analytics combine with Azure VMware Solutions to help customers by creating a great value proposition versus bringing legacy solutions into Azure for VM management and operations. And that concludes my session on Azure VMware Solution. Hopefully you can see why we think it can accelerate your digital transformation related to cloud adoption. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter for more info as time unfolds. And thanks again to Dwayne for allowing me to present a session on Azure VMware Solution.